When my sister uninvited me from her royal wedding because my ink-stained hands would embarrass her noble in-laws, I stayed in my workshop. I'm Yolanda, 48, a rare document conservator from Annapolis. She wanted a fairy tale. She forgot I hold the keys to the truth. If you've ever been the sibling who stayed behind to sweep up the dust while someone else chased the spotlight, you know how quiet the world gets when the door is shut in your face. You learn to find comfort in the steady things. For me, that's the smell of beeswax, the cool weight of a bone folder in my palm, and the dry, whispering sigh of 200-year-old rag paper. I've spent 25 years in my small shop off the Annapolis Harbor, restoring historical land grants, family Bibles, and ancient municipal charters. It's meticulous, invisible work. You don't get famous doing it, but you learn how to spot a lie from a mile away. A single drop of modern synthetic glue on a 17th century spine tells you everything you need to know about what someone is trying to hide. My younger sister, Sienna, never cared for the old ways. She was 28, beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that requires constant upkeep, and she possessed an absolute horror of anything that looked like hard work. To Sienna, my workshop was a tomb. She couldn't stand the smell of the wheat starch paste I boiled on my small stove, or the sight of my calloused fingertips stained with iron gall ink. Our mother, Beatrice, had spent her entire life feeding Sienna's belief that she was destined for a castle. When our father passed away 10 years ago, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a crumbling historic house, Beatrice didn't try to pay off the creditors. Instead, she took out a second mortgage to send Sienna to a finishing school in Switzerland. I was the one who stayed behind. I refinanced my shop, worked 14-hour days, and paid off the local builders and the tax office so my mother wouldn't lose her roof. I didn't ask for a thank you. I just wanted peace. Then, Sienna met Leopold. He wasn't just a wealthy European. He was the hereditary prince of Aloria, a tiny, fiercely traditional Alpine principality tucked between Austria and Switzerland. The Alorian royal family was old money, the kind of old money that doesn't advertise, but owns half the timber and banking assets in Central Europe. When the engagement was announced, my mother nearly fainted with joy. Suddenly, our modest family was being written about in international society columns. Sienna was photographed wearing cashmere coats that cost more than my annual workshop utilities, looking every bit the regal bride --B. But Aloria is not a modern, relaxed monarchy. They are governed by the House Laws of 1704, a strict legal code that dictates who can marry into the succession. Under these laws, any prospective bride from a non-noble family must present a certified, authenticated declaration of clean standing. It's a legal document proving the bride's family has no active bankruptcies, no criminal judgments, and holds clean title to their ancestral properties. Essentially, the King Leopold's father, King Christian, wanted to ensure his son wasn't marrying into a family of grifters looking to drain the royal treasury. Because the documents had to be compiled from Maryland Historical Archives where our great-grandparents settled. And because the Alorian court required an internationally certified archival seal, Sienna had no choice but to come to me. She walked into my workshop 3 months ago, the heels of her designer boots clicking loudly on my worn pine floorboards. She didn't hug me. She just dropped a heavy leather folder onto my workbench right next to a delicate 1790 ship's log I was conserving. "I need you to certify these, Yolanda," she said, her voice tight and commanding. "The Alorian Royal Chancellery needs the certified translation and the official state seal of registry, and they need it by the end of the month." I opened the folder. Inside were our family's financial records, the deeds to our grandfather's old farm in western Maryland, and our mother's current bank statements. As I flipped through the pages, my heart sank. The documents had been heavily altered. The outstanding mortgages had been digitally erased from the deeds. A non-existent trust fund of $3 million had been added under our mother's name, complete with a forged bank officer's signature. I looked up at my sister. "Sienna, This is fraud. If I put my official archival seal on this, I'm committing a federal crime. Not to mention, if the Elorian Chancellery does a basic audit, they'll catch it instantly. Sienna's face hardened. They won't audit it if it has your seal. You're the only certified registrar in the Mid-Atlantic region recognized by the European Archival Union. Your word is law to them. Just sign the verification certificate and stamp it. I can't do that, I said softly. I've spent 25 years building my reputation. I won't lie for you. It's not a lie, it's a formality, she snapped, leaning over the counter. Leo loves me. Once we're married, the Elorian Treasury will clear our mother's debts anyway. I just need to get through the ceremony. Don't ruin this for me, Yolanda. You've always been jealous of my life. That hurt. It was a dull, familiar ache, but it hurt nonetheless. I'm not jealous, Sienna. I'm honest. I will compile our true family history, and I will certify the actual deeds. But I will not sign off on a fabrication. She snatched the folder off my desk, her eyes flashing with pure venom. Then you're useless to me, she whispered. 2 weeks later, the wedding invitation arrived. Or rather, it didn't. My daughter Claire, a sensible 21-year-old who helps me in the shop after her university classes, came upstairs to our small apartment above the workshop with a look of quiet fury on her face. She held her phone out to me. "Look at Aunt Sienna's wedding website, Mom," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly. "The guest list RSVP portal is locked. I called Grandma to ask why we hadn't received our physical invitations yet. Do you know what she told me?" I set down my teacup. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator. "What did she say, Claire?" "She said that because the wedding is being held at the National Cathedral in D.C., and because the king himself is attending, the guest list had to be extremely curated," she said. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She said you would embarrass them. She told Grandma that your clothes look like they come from a thrift store, that your hands are always stained with chemicals, and that you don't know how to talk to people of their caliber. She said it's better if we just stay home." I sat there for a long moment, looking at my hands. They were indeed stained with the dark, stubborn spots of walnut stain I'd been using to restore a federal period desk. My nails were short, trimmed, practical for handling delicate vellum. I had worked 50 hours that week to pay for Claire's college textbooks. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said, though my chest felt tight, as if a band of iron were winding around my ribs. "We have plenty of work to do here. We don't need to be where we aren't wanted." "It's not all right," Claire cried, sitting down beside me and grabbing my hand. "You paid off Grandma's debts? You paid for Sienna's braces when she was a teenager? How can they treat you like you're some kind of dirty secret?" "Because to them, the truth is dirty," I said quietly. I didn't make a scene. I didn't call my mother to scream at her, and I didn't send angry text messages to Sienna. I simply went back to my workshop. But I did one thing. I took the original unfalsified family ledger, the one containing the actual registered mortgage documents and the certified state tax liens on our mother's property, and I locked it inside my heavy iron safe. I also drafted a formal letter to the Maryland State Archivist, noting that a draft genealogical record under our family name had been removed from my office without my final signature or seal. It was a standard professional precaution. I didn't do it out of malice. I did it to protect my license. Today was the day of the wedding. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the Grand Cathedral in Washington, D.C., followed by a lavish reception at a historic estate in Virginia. The local news had been covering it all morning, calling it the American Royal Romance. Claire and I spent the day in the workshop. We kept the shades drawn to block out the humid Maryland heat, working in the cool, quiet light of our desk lamps. I was restoring a 19th century ledger, carefully applying Japanese tissue to torn edges with a tiny brush. Around 6 in the evening, we went upstairs to make a simple dinner of chicken and rice. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the television playing quietly in the background, when the news anchor's voice suddenly changed tone. We are receiving breaking reports from the National Cathedral, the anchor said, looking flustered. The royal wedding of Prince Leopold and Miss Sienna Vance has reportedly been halted. Guests are being asked to remain in their seats. There are unconfirmed reports of a major legal dispute regarding the bride's documentation. Claire and I looked at each other, the forks halfway to our mouths. Before either of us could speak, a low, powerful rumble vibrated through the floorboards of our old building. I looked out the kitchen window. 3 massive, gleaming black SUVs with diplomatic plates and dark-tinted windows had pulled up directly in front of my shop, blocking the narrow, historic street. A second later, the heavy iron knocker on my front door downstairs began to clang with a rhythmic, thunderous authority. I didn't run to the door. When you spend your life handling documents that are hundreds of years old, you learn that rushing only tears things that are already fragile. I wiped my hands on a clean linen dish towel, set it deliberately on the edge of the kitchen counter, and looked at Claire. Her young face was pale, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, sudden hope. "Stay here, sweetheart," I said softly. "No," Claire replied, her voice firm with that stubborn streak she inherited from my father. "I'm coming with you." I didn't argue. We walked down the narrow, creaking wooden staircase that led from our apartment to the back of the workshop. The heavy clanging on the front door didn't stop. It was a rhythmic, commanding sound that seemed to shake the very dust from the ceiling beams. Through the frosted glass of my shop door, I could see the tall, dark silhouettes of 2 men. Outside, the blue and red lights of a police escort painted the historic brick walls of the alleyway in pulsing, silent flashes. I unlocked the deadbolt. The brass handle felt cold in my hand. When I pulled the door open, the humid Maryland evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of salt water from the harbor and the faint, hot smell of idling diesel engines. 2 men stood on my threshold. They were dressed in impeccable, charcoal gray morning suits, the kind of formal attire that looked entirely out of place on a humid Friday evening in Annapolis. On their left lapels, they wore small, discreet pins made of brushed platinum, a stylized mountain eagle clutching a scepter, the crest of the House of Aloria. Behind them stood a Maryland state trooper, his hands resting casually but alertly near his belt, and a third man in a dark civilian suit who looked like he belonged to a federal diplomatic security detail. The man in the front was older, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes the color of winter flint. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years delivering unpleasant news with absolute precision. "Yolanda Vance?" he asked. His accent was thick, cultured, and distinctly Austrian-German. "I am," I said, keeping my voice steady. I didn't shrink back. I stood on my worn pine floorboards in my denim apron, my hands still faintly stained with the dark walnut ink of my trade. "I am Chancellor Hans Dieter Kessel of the Alorian Royal Chancellery," he said, bowing his head by a fraction of an inch. It was a gesture of official protocol, not respect. "This is Director Vance of the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions. We have been instructed by His Majesty, King Christian, to locate you immediately. Your presence is required at the National Cathedral in Washington." I let the silence stretch between us for a moment. I know some of you reading this might have gasped or felt that sudden surge of triumph when the people who threw you out suddenly realize they need you. But in that moment, all I felt was a cold, heavy sadness. My sister's wedding had been halted. My mother's grand dream was crumbling, and it had all happened exactly the way I warned them it would. "The National Cathedral is an hour's drive from here, Chancellor," I said quietly. "And as you can see, my shop is closed for the evening. I am not dressed for a royal affair." "This is not an invitation to a social gathering, Miss Vance," Chancellor Kessel said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "It is a matter of state security and international legal integrity. The marriage of the hereditary prince cannot be finalized. The king has called a halt to the proceedings because the declaration of clean standing submitted by your mother and sister has been flagged as a fraudulent document. Flagged by whom? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The European Archival Union's digital registry, Kessel replied, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. An automated alert was sent to our embassy in D.C. 3 hours ago. It stated that a draft genealogical and financial certification bearing your professional registration number was flagged as an unauthorized, unsigned removal from the Maryland State Archives. The king refuses to allow the ceremony to proceed until the original, certified records are produced and verified by the registrar of record. That is you. He stepped closer, the leather of his expensive shoes creaking. Your sister, Sienna, has informed His Majesty that you are mentally unstable. She claims you withheld the certified documents out of jealousy and fabricated a report to the state archives to sabotage her marriage. She claims she has the real certified documents in her possession, signed by you. We have those documents here. He reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a high-resolution color printout of the verification certificate. He held it out to me. I didn't take it. I didn't need to. Even from 2 feet away, I could see the glaring errors. That is a draft, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet of my shop. The registration number on the header belongs to a 19th century probate record I restored last winter. The signature at the bottom is a digital composite of my name taken from my public business website. And the embossed seal, I pointed to the flat printed circle in the lower right corner, is a flat graphic. My professional seal is a physical, 3-dimensional blind stamp. It leaves a raised impression on 40-pound rag paper that can be felt by touch. It cannot be replicated by a laser printer. Chancellor Kessel's eyes hardened. The flint in them turned to ice. He looked at the State Department representative, then back to me. Then you did not sign this? I did not, I said. And if you will allow me a moment, I will show you why. I turned and walked back into the depths of my workshop, my boots clicking softly on the floor. Claire followed close behind me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The Chancellor and the State Department director followed us, their eyes scanning the shelves of ancient books, the jars of chemical solvents, and the heavy cast-iron presses that filled my workspace. I walked to the corner of the room where my grandfather's old iron safe stood. It was a massive black monolith from the late 19th century, decorated with faded gold leaf lettering that read * York Safe and Lock Co. *. It had survived 3 fires and 2 floods, and it was the only place in the world where I kept the things that truly mattered. I knelt in front of the safe. My knees popped in the quiet room, a reminder of 48 years of hard work and long hours on my feet. I spun the heavy brass dial, left to 24, right to 8, left to 62. With a deep metallic click, the heavy bolt disengaged. I pulled the heavy iron door open. Inside, resting on a velvet-lined shelf, was a thick blue buckram folder. Beside it lay my official registrar's embossing Sela-heavy brass hand press that had belonged to my mentor before me. I pulled the folder out and set it on the large, zinc-topped examination table in the center of the workshop. I turned on the overhead halogen magnifying lamp, casting a bright white circle of light over the metal surface. This, I said, opening the folder, is the true record of the Vance family standing. I began to lay out the documents, one by one, my movements slow and deliberate. I felt like a doctor explaining a terminal diagnosis. No joy, no anger, just the cold, hard facts of the case. These are the original certified deeds to our grandfather's farm in Washington County, I said, tapping a yellowed sheet of heavy paper with a distinct, watermarked chain line. You will note the active tax liens from the state of Maryland, totaling $84,000, dated April of this year. These liens were never cleared. I slid another document forward. This is the true bank statement for my mother, Beatrice Vance. As of Tuesday, her personal checking account had a balance of $214.12. The second mortgage on her home in Annapolis is currently 60 days past due. There is no $3 million trust fund. There never has been. Chancellor Kessel leaned over the table, his face pale as he examined the documents. He reached out and touched the raised, textured seal on the bottom of the true deeds. He ran his thumb over the embossed paper, feeling the distinct, crisp ridges of my professional stamp. "And this," I said, pulling out a carbon copy of a letter, "is the formal notification I sent to the Maryland State Archivist 3 weeks ago, stating that a draft of our family records had been taken from my office without authorization and without my final signature. I filed it the morning after my sister took the files from this desk." The room was completely silent save for the low hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. Chancellor Kessel stood up slowly. He looked at the forged document in his hand, then at the authentic, certified ledger on my table. The contrast was undeniable. One was a cheap, digital lie. The other was a heavy, painful truth. "They lied to us," Kessel whispered, more to himself than to me. "The entire family. They swore under oath to the Chancellery that these records were clean." "My sister wanted her castle, Chancellor," I said softly. "And my mother wanted to pretend that the bills didn't exist anymore. They thought that once the ring was on Sienna's finger, the Elorian treasury would make the lies disappear." Kessel looked at me, his eyes searching my face. "You knew this would happen. You knew that by refusing to sign, you would destroy your sister's chance at this marriage." "I didn't destroy anything," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "The truth destroyed it. I simply refused to be the one who lied for them. There is a difference." The State Department director stepped forward, looking at his watch. "Chancellor, we have to go. The king has been holding the wedding party in the private apartments of the cathedral for over 2 hours. The press is starting to ask questions. We need Miss Vance in these documents in D.C. immediately." Kessel nodded. He turned to me, his manner shifting from official coldness to a quiet, desperate pleading. "Miss Vance, I must ask you to come with us. The king will not accept copies. He demands to see the original ledger, and he demands to hear the truth from your own mouth. Your sister is currently accusing the Chancellery of a political conspiracy. She claims we are trying to ruin her. Only you can settle this." I looked down at the blue folder. I thought of my mother's voice on the phone, telling Claire that I was an embarrassment. I thought of Sienna's sharp, beautiful face as she told me I was useless because I wouldn't commit a federal crime for her vanity. They had left me behind in the dust, but now they needed my dust-stained hands to save them from themselves. "Mom," Claire whispered, grabbing my hand, "you don't have to go. They treated you like garbage. Let them figure it out on their own." I squeezed Claire's hand. I looked at the old, worn tools of my trade scattered across the workbench. I had spent my life restoring things that were broken, bringing order to chaos, and preserving the truth of the past so the future could be built on solid ground. If I stayed here, the lie would keep spinning. Sienna would continue to play the victim, and my mother would continue to blame me for her own failures. It was time to put an end to the story they had written about me. "I'll get my coat, Chancellor," I said. I reached down, closed the blue buckram folder, and slid it into my professional leather portfolio. I picked up my heavy brass embossing seal and slipped it into the pocket of my coat. I wasn't going to Washington as a wedding guest, and I wasn't going as an embarrassed sibling. I was going as the keeper of the truth. The ride from Annapolis to Washington, D.C. was the quietest 60 minutes of my life. I sat in the middle row of the massive, armored SUV, the leather seats so clean they smelled like a brand-new car dealership. Claire sat right beside me, her small hand slipped inside mine, her fingers warm and steady. Across from us, riding backward, was Chancellor Kessel. He didn't speak. He spent the entire journey on an encrypted satellite phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur in German, his eyes occasionally darting to my worn leather portfolio resting on my lap. Outside the tinted windows, the Maryland highway blurred into a smear of gray asphalt and green summer trees. The humidity of the late afternoon was pressing hard against the glass, leaving beads of condensation that tracked downward like tears. I looked down at my lap. I was still wearing my work clothes, a pair of dark denim trousers, a simple linen blouse, and my sturdy leather boots. I hadn't even taken off my silver watch, the one with the scratched face that my father gave me when I opened my shop. I looked like a woman who had just stepped away from a workbench, which was exactly what I was. Beside me, the Chancellor looked like he was attending a funeral, his stiff, charcoal gray morning suit reflecting the sterile luxury of his world. Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat in a space so quiet that you could hear the machinery of your own life grinding to a halt? If you've ever had to hold the line when everyone else in your family is telling you to just let the lie slide for the sake of appearances, you know how heavy that silence is. You start to wonder if maybe you are the cold one. You ask yourself if it would have been easier to just sign the paper, close your eyes, and let them have their fairy tale. But then I looked at the blue buckram folder beneath my hands. I thought of the $84,000 in unpaid state tax liens on my mother's house. I thought of the local contractors I had paid out of my own pocket so she wouldn't lose her roof, while she was busy buying Sienna's plane tickets to Switzerland. A lie is like a wet sheet of paper. The harder you pull to smooth it out, the faster it tears. I hadn't wet the paper. I was just the one refusing to pretend the tear wasn't there. "The king is waiting in the bishop's parlor," Chancellor Kessel said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence as the SUV turned off the highway and began to navigate the crowded, historic streets of Northwest D.C. "The wedding guests are still in the nave. We told them there was a sudden administrative delay regarding the registry, but they are growing restless. The press is already tweeting about a royal crisis." "And my sister?" I asked quietly. "She is with your mother in the bride's dressing room," Kessel replied, his jaw tightening. "She has spent the last 2 hours screaming at the royal guard, claiming that this is a bureaucratic insult. She insists that you are the one who committed the fraud to ruin her life." I didn't answer. I just squeezed Claire's hand a little tighter. When we pulled up to the National Cathedral, the scene was surreal. The massive Gothic structure of Indiana limestone towered into the humid evening sky, its spires glowing in the setting sun. But at the street level, it was a circus. Dozens of media trucks with high-reaching satellite dishes were parked along the curb. Security barriers kept back a crowd of onlookers, their faces pressed against the barricades, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Our SUV didn't stop at the main entrance. We bypassed the grand steps and drove down a private ramp, heading toward the quiet, secluded side entrance near the bishop's garden. The moment the vehicle stopped, the door was pulled open by a security officer in a dark suit. Though a heavy, damp heat of Washington hit me first, followed immediately by the cool, air-conditioned draft of the cathedral's stone interior. "This way, please," Chancellor Kessel said, stepping out and gesturing for us to follow. We walked through a maze of quiet, vaulted stone corridors. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the high ceilings, the sharp click of the Chancellor's dress shoes, the lighter tap of Claire's flats, and the heavy, solid thud of my work boots. We passed stained glass windows that cast long, colorful pools of red and blue light across the limestone floor. It was beautiful, but it felt cold. It felt like a monument built to withstand the centuries, entirely indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding within its walls. Kessel led us to a heavy oak door at the end of a quiet hallway. 2 tall Elorian royal guards, dressed in formal military uniforms with gold-braided epaulets, stood at attention on either side. When they saw the Chancellor, they immediately stepped aside, their white-gloved hands opening the double doors. Inside, the bishop's parlor was a grand, wood-paneled room filled with antique furniture, heavy velvet draperies, and the scent of old wax and lemon oil. A large Persian rug covered the floor, and a massive mahogany table sat in the center of the room. But I didn't look at the furniture. I looked at the people. Standing near the window, his back to us, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron gray hair, wearing a dark military dress uniform adorned with medals. King Christian of Eloria. When the door opened, he turned slowly. His face was weathered, his brow furrowed with a deep, permanent line of authority. And there, sitting on a silk-upholstered sofa in the corner, were my mother and my sister. Sienna looked breathtaking and entirely tragic. She was wearing a custom-made silk file wedding gown with a sweeping train that lay coiled around her feet like a dying white swan. Her diamond tiara was slightly crooked, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. My mother, Beatrice, sat beside her, clutching a lace handkerchief, her pale lavender mother of the bride dress looking wrinkled and damp. The moment Sienna saw me walk through the door, she stood up so fast her silk train hissed against the carpet. "You!" she gasped, her voice shrill and trembling with pure rage. "How dare you show your face here? You ruined my wedding. You lied to the chancellery? You're an embarrassment, Yolanda. You've always been an embarrassment." "Sienna, sit down," King Christian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of an anvil. The absolute authority in his tone made my sister freeze mid-step. She looked at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, before she slowly sank back onto the sofa beside our mother. My mother looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and bitter resentment. "Yolanda," she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do this to your sister? After everything we've been through, after all the sacrifices I made for you." I stood there in the center of the grand room, my leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I felt the sting of her words, the familiar, dull ache of being the family scapegoat. But this time, the pain didn't make me shrink. It made me solid. "I didn't do anything to Sienna, Mother," I said, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly steady. "I simply refused to sign my name to a lie. You took a draft of our family records from my desk and tried to pass it off as a certified legal document. You knew it was a forgery." "It wasn't a forgery," Sienna cried, her fingers digging into the silk of her gown. "It was just a formality. We were going to pay off those stupid debts the second the wedding was over. Leo promised me." "You're just jealous because you're stuck in that dusty little shop with your ink-stained hands, while I'm supposed to be a princess." I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I walked slowly over to the massive mahogany table in the center of the room. I set my leather portfolio down on the polished wood. With slow, deliberate movements, I unzipped the leather, pulled out the thick, blue buckram folder, and laid it flat on the table. Then I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my heavy brass embossing seal, and set it down beside the folder with a solid, metallic clink. "Your Majesty," I said, looking directly at King Christian. I ignored my sister's whimpering and my mother's gasps. "I am Yolanda Vance. I am a certified document conservator and a registered archival officer for the state of Maryland, recognized by the European Archival Union. My professional registration number is 4409. The king walked slowly over to the table. His eyes went from my face to the blue folder, and then to the brass seal. "This," I said, opening the folder, "is the true certified record of the Vance family standing. I have compiled it from the official state archives, and I have personally verified every deed, every tax record, and every bank statement." I turned the folder toward him. "I invite you to look at the truth." The silence in the room became absolute, save for the distant, muffled sound of the cathedral's pipe organ playing a slow, repetitive air to keep the waiting guests calm. It was the moment of reckoning, the point where the beautiful, expensive illusions my sister had built began to collide with the heavy, unyielding weight of reality. King Christian of Aloria did not look like a man who was easily swayed by tears or tantrums. He stood over my grandfather's blue buckram folder, his large, heavy hands resting flat on the polished mahogany table. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the bishop's parlor was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the muffled, distant drone of the cathedral's pipe organ. Still trying to pacify the thousands of confused guests waiting in the nave, the king picked up my heavy brass embossing seal, He held it in his hand, feeling its solid, metallic weight, his thumb tracing the worn engraving of the Maryland State Registry. Then, he picked up the forged document Sienna had submitted to the Chancellery and compared it to the genuine deed I had just laid before him. He didn't need a magnifying glass. He was a man who had signed thousands of state treaties and historical decrees. He knew what real authority felt like. He ran his fingers over the flat, printed circle on Sienna's paper, and then he pressed his thumb against the deep, crisp, raised ridges of the physical stamp on my authentic record. "This flat mark," the king said, his voice low and vibrating with a quiet, dangerous calm. "It is a photocopy, a digital imitation." "It was just a temporary draft, Your Majesty," Sienna cried, taking a frantic step forward, her massive silk train dragging behind her like a heavy, broken wing. She reached out, her white-gloved hands trembling as she tried to touch the king's sleeve, but Chancellor Kessel silently stepped between them. "Yolanda is lying to you. She's always hated me. She's doing this because she's a bitter, lonely woman who wants to drag me down to her level. Leo, tell him! Tell your father she's crazy." As if on cue, the side door of the parlor opened, and Prince Leopold entered. He looked striking in his white and gold military dress uniform, his chest adorned with the colorful ribbons of Elorian orders. But his face was completely drained of color. He looked at his father, then at Sienna's tear-stained face, and finally at me, standing there in my work trousers and denim-stained fingers. "Father," Leopold said, his voice tight, "the bishop is asking for a statement. The guests are whispering. What is the meaning of this delay? Who is this woman?" "This," King Christian said, pointing a heavy finger at me, "is Yolanda Vance, the actual registrar. The woman your bride claimed was mentally unfit. The woman who actually holds the legal title to the documents you swore were authentic." Leopold turned his gaze to Sienna, his eyes narrowing. "Sienna? What is he talking about?" Before Sienna could speak, our mother, Beatrice, stood up from the sofa. She smoothed her damp lavender dress, her face contorted into a mask of desperate, maternal outrage. "Your Majesty, please," she said, her voice trembling with a high-pitched, fragile dignity. "We are a respectable family. My late husband was a proud man. There has been a misunderstanding. Yolanda is. She has always been difficult. She lives in the past, hoarding these old papers. She refused to help her own sister. We only did what we had to do to protect our family's privacy from foreign bureaucrats. What does a small tax lien or a minor mortgage matter when two young people are in love? The Elorian treasury can clear these trivial debts in a single day. I want to stop here for a moment and talk to you. If you have ever sat at a table while your own family members looked you in the eye and treated your honesty like it was a betrayal, you know the exact temperature of the air in that room. You know how it feels when the people who raised you, the people who should have your back, treat your hard work and your integrity as if it's a weapon you're using to hurt them. They wanted me to feel like the criminal because I wouldn't help them steal a life they hadn't earned. But I didn't look at my mother with anger. I looked at her with a profound, hollow pity. "A trivial debt, Mother," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the high-ceilinged room. $84,000 in state tax liens is not trivial. A second mortgage that is 60 days past due is not a misunderstanding. You took a draft document from my desk, digitally erased those liabilities, created a fictional $3 million trust fund under your name, and forged my professional signature and seal to pass it off to a foreign government. That is not a formality. That is a Class 1 felony in the state of Maryland, and it is a direct violation of the Elorian House laws of 1704. I turned to Prince Leopold. "Your Highness, if you married my sister today under these documents, your marriage would be legally void under your own country's constitution. The Elorian Chancellery would have been forced to audit these records within 6 months. When the forgery was discovered, it wouldn't just be a family embarrassment. It would be an international scandal that would strip your future children of their succession rights. Leopold stared at me, the truth of my words sinking into him like cold water. He looked at the blue folder on the table, then at Sienna. "You lied to me," Leopold whispered. The softness of his voice was more devastating than a shout. "You told me your family's estate was completely clear. You told me your sister was a bitter recluse who refused to attend because she despised my family. You made me believe she was the enemy." "Leo, no!" Sienna sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck, her diamond tiara finally slipping off her head and clattering onto the Persian rug. "I love you. I did it for us. I knew your father would never let us marry if he knew about my mother's financial problems. I just wanted to be your wife. What difference does the money make? You have so much of it." Leopold slowly, deliberately, reached up and removed her hands from his neck. He stepped back, his face hard and expressionless. "It is not about the money, Sienna. It is about the oath. In Aloria, our word is our law. You built our entire future on a forgery signed with your sister's stolen name." King Christian turned to Chancellor Kessel. "Call the bishop," the king commanded, his voice cold and absolute. "Tell him the ceremony is cancelled. Inform the press that the wedding has been postponed indefinitely due to an unresolved legal discrepancy in the bride's documentation." "No!" Sienna shrieked, falling to her knees, her beautiful silk file gown pooling around her in a crumpled, ruined heap. "You can't do this! The press is outside. Everyone is watching. Please, King Christian, please. We can just sign a new paper. Yolanda can sign it right now. Yolanda, please, just stamp the paper. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll pay you back for everything." My mother rushed to Sienna's side, kneeling beside her on the rug, both of them clutching at each other as if they were drowning. Beatrice looked up at me, her eyes filled with a bitter, venomous hatred. "Are you happy now, Yolanda?" she hissed. "You've ruined your sister's life. You've destroyed this family. I hope your precious honesty keeps you warm at night in that dusty, pathetic little shop." I stood my ground. I looked down at my mother and sister, kneeling on the expensive Persian rug in their designer silk and lavender lace, surrounded by the gold and platinum of a world they had tried to steal. They looked so small. For 25 years, I had carried their debts, swept up their mess, and let them treat me like a dirty secret so they could pretend to be royalty. But the truth has a funny way of leveling the playing field. "My shop isn't pathetic, Mother," I said softly, my voice filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. "It's honest. It paid for Claire's education. It paid for the roof over your head. And unlike this wedding, it was built on a foundation that doesn't collapse when the wind blows." I reached down to the mahogany table. I picked up my heavy brass embossing seal and slipped it back into my coat pocket. I zipped my leather portfolio closed, tucking the blue buckram folder securely under my arm. I looked at King Christian. He bowed his head too, me not a fraction of an inch this time, but a deep, respectful nod of a sovereign recognizing an equal. "Thank you, Miss Vance," the king said quietly. "You have saved my house from a great dishonor." "I didn't do it for your house, Your Majesty," I replied, looking him in the eye. "I did it for mine." I turned and walked toward the double doors. Claire was waiting for me, her eyes shining with pride, her hand reaching out to take mine. As the royal guards opened the heavy oak doors to let us out, I heard the distant, sudden roar of the crowd outside the cathedral as the official announcement of the cancellation began to filter through the gates. We walked back down the long, quiet stone corridors of the cathedral, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind us, in the bishop's parlor, the illusion had finally shattered, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of the truth. The ride back to Annapolis was as quiet as the ride out, but the air inside the SUV felt lighter, as if a storm had finally broken and cleared the humidity from the sky. The State Department driver dropped Claire and me off at the corner of our historic street, just as the church bells down the block chimed 10 o'clock. We didn't talk about what had happened in the bishop's parlor on the way home. We didn't need to. When we unlocked the heavy wooden door of my workshop, the familiar scent of beeswax, lavender oil, and dry paper enveloped us like a warm wool blanket. I locked the front door behind us, turned on the small, low-wattage lamp on my workbench, and stood there for a long moment, just breathing in the quiet. I took my heavy brass embossing seal out of my coat pocket and placed it back on its velvet-lined shelf inside the York safe. I didn't slam the safe door. I closed it with a soft, metallic click, spinning the dial back to 0. It was over. The truth was locked away where it belonged, safe and unyielding. In the weeks that followed, the International Society pages had a field day. The royal wedding that never was. The headlines screamed. The Ilorian Royal Chancellery issued a brief, sterile statement citing unresolved administrative and legal discrepancies in the bride's domestic documentation. There was no mention of forgery, no public shaming of my sister, and no reference to the small workshop in Annapolis. King Christian had kept his word. He protected his house's dignity, and in doing so, he protected ours from a public circus. Prince Leopold returned to Europe 3 days after the cancellation. I heard through the professional grapevine that he had thrown himself into his family's forestry initiatives in the Alps, far away from the cameras and the socialites of Washington. Sienna didn't come back to Annapolis. She couldn't bear the whispers of the local boutique owners or the pitying looks of the neighbors who had watched her brag about her royal romance for months. She packed her designer bags and moved to Miami, finding a job as a marketing coordinator for a luxury yacht broker. From what Claire tells me, she is still beautiful, still sharp, and still looking for a man with a title, though her social media accounts are now private and her circle is much smaller. She doesn't call me. I didn't expect her to. To Sienna, I will always be the villain who pulled the curtain back on her grand illusion. But my mother, Beatrice, had nowhere else to go. 2 months after the cathedral doors were shut, the bank finally moved to foreclose on her historic cottage. The second mortgage was too far gone, and without Sienna's royal marriage to bail her out, the house of cards collapsed. I know some of you reading this might think I should have let the bank take the house. You might think that after the way she treated me, after she called me an embarrassment and tried to erase my life's work, she deserved to sit in the ruins of her own vanity. And I'll admit, there were nights when I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the unpaid notices, and felt the cold temptation to just turn my back. I felt the weight of 25 years of being the daughter who stayed behind to sweep up, while my sister was given the world on a silver platter. But if you've ever had to make these kinds of decisions at your own kitchen table, you know that revenge is a hungry guest. The more you feed it, the louder it gets, and it never leaves you with peace. I didn't want revenge. I wanted boundaries. I went to the local bank in Annapolis. I sat down with the commercial loan officer, a man I'd known for 15 years, and I worked out a structured purchase of my mother's second mortgage note. I used the savings I had set aside for my workshop's expansion, along with a modest business equity loan. I bought the debt, but I didn't hand the deed back to my mother. Instead, I had my attorney draft a formal, legally binding life estate trust. The property was transferred into Claire's name as the sole beneficiary, ensuring that the home my grandfather built would stay in our family and never be leveraged for another quick loan. My mother was granted the right to live in the cottage for the rest of her days, but under one strict condition. She had to pay a modest monthly rent directly to Claire's college fund, a sum that covered the basic property taxes and insurance. No more free rides, no more pretending the bills didn't exist. Every dollar was accounted for, signed, and sealed on archival grade paper. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday in November when my mother came to my workshop to sign the lease agreement. The wind was coming off the Severn River, rattling the old glass panes of my front window. I had a small fire going in the cast-iron stove in the corner, the smell of birchwood mixing with the scent of the wheat paste I was boiling for a 19th-century map restoration. My mother walked in, her steps slower than they used to be. She wasn't wearing her lavender mother-of-the-bride lace or her expensive perfume. She wore a simple wool coat, her silver hair pulled back into a neat, quiet bun. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped running from the clock. She sat down at the zinc-topped examination table. I set a cup of hot chamomile tea in front of her, the steam rising between us in the quiet room. "Yolanda," she said, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the wood stove. She looked at the lease agreement resting in the center of the table, right next to my brass embossing seal. I don't know what to say to you. You don't have to say anything, Mother," I replied, sitting down across from her. I didn't reach out to take her hand and she didn't offer hers. The distance between us was still there, a wide, silent river of years and choices, but the water was no longer angry. "Just sign the papers. The first payment is due on the 1st of the month." She picked up the vintage fountain pen I had laid out for her. Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name on the bottom line. Asterisk Beatrice Vance. Asterisk, it was the same name she had forged on the papers she took from my desk, but this time the ink was real. This time the commitment was true. She set the pen down and looked at me, her eyes clouded with a quiet, lingering regret. "You always were so much like your father," she whispered. "Stubborn. So stubborn about the details. Daddy knew that if you don't take care of the foundation, the roof will eventually fall on your head," I said softly. "I'm just keeping the roof up, Mother." She nodded slowly, took a sip of her tea, and for the first time in 10 years, we sat in a silence that didn't feel like a weapon. It wasn't a warm, tearful reconciliation. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic embraces, and no promises of a perfect family dinner. We are too old for fairy tales, and too much damage has been done to pretend otherwise. But the door was left ajar, just enough for a little light to get through. After she left, Claire came down the stairs from our apartment, carrying a stack of clean linen rags for the workshop. She stood by the window, watching my mother's small figure walk down the brick sidewalk until she disappeared around the corner of the harbor. "Are you okay, Mom?" Claire asked, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the dark, stubborn spots of iron gall ink, the marks of a trade that requires patience, precision, and an absolute respect for the truth. I looked at the lease agreement on the table, the ink dry and permanent under the low light of my desk lamp. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart," I said, a deep, quiet warmth settling into my chest. "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow. Let's close up the shop." If you are sitting at your own kitchen table tonight, holding a pen and wondering if you have the strength to set that hard boundary with the people who should love you, I want you to remember something. Love is a gift, not a line item in a budget, and it certainly isn't a license for people to use your life as currency for their illusions. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to stop carrying the weight of their lies and let them feel the solid, honest ground beneath their feet. It might hurt them, and it will certainly hurt you, but it is the only way anyone ever learns how to walk. I turned off the lamp on my workbench, letting the shadows of the old tools blend into the quiet dark of the room. I walked upstairs with my daughter, our footsteps steady and synchronized on the wooden stairs, leaving the dust of the past exactly where it belonged.